You put in the hours, collect your paycheck, and for a short moment, there's relief. Then it fades away. Rent, bills, random little purchases you barely think about, somehow they pile up faster than you expect. And before long, you're right back where you started, waiting for the next payday so the cycle can begin again. It's not because you're careless. You're doing your best to handle what you have. You pay attention to your spending, you try to make smart choices, but no matter how aware you are, the same pattern keeps showing up. Earn, spend, repeat. Earn, spend, repeat. After enough time, it starts becoming exhausting because you're making the effort, showing discipline, doing everything you were told was supposed to work. So why does it still feel like nothing is moving forward? Why does progress seem so slow it's almost impossible to notice? That's the question most people never truly confront. They assume the answer is income, believing that if they earned more, everything would finally improve. But years pass, salaries rise for some people, and the same cycle remains because the problem isn't only about how much money enters your hands, it's about what happens the instant it arrives. For most people, money moves without direction. It flows toward whatever feels urgent, whatever pulls attention in the moment. Bills, routines, tiny choices that seem harmless on their own, yet together they quietly consume everything. And because it happens little by little, it starts to feel normal, expected, familiar. But something being normal does not mean it is effective. There is a difference between spending money and guiding it, between reacting to expenses and deciding beforehand where your money is to go. And that difference is what separates activity from progress. Because when money has no clear purpose, it disappears. Not all at once, not in dramatic ways, but steadily. A little here, a little there, until what you worked for no longer feels like it's creating anything meaningful. And this is where the cycle keeps people trapped. Not because they lack ability, but because the system they follow is incomplete. It emphasizes earning, but ignores direction. And without direction, even hard work struggles to create lasting change. Think about it. How many times have you reached the end of the month wondering where your money actually went? Not carelessly, but with a strange feeling that it slipped away without you fully noticing. That confusion is not random. It comes from money moving without intention. But imagine if that changed. Imagine if every dollar you earned already had a purpose before it ever left your account. Not just a vague idea, but a specific role connected to something that pushes your life forward instead of keeping you in the same place. Because the moment you assign purpose to money, something begins to shift. You start seeing it differently. You stop viewing it as something you merely manage and begin seeing it as something you direct. And that shift creates awareness. Suddenly, you notice patterns you never recognized before. Habits that once felt automatic become obvious. Choices that once seemed small begin revealing their long-term effects. At first, it can feel automatic, become obvious. Choices that once seemed small begin revealing their long-term effects. At first, it can feel strange, even uncomfortable, but that discomfort is where control begins because once awareness exists, adjustment becomes possible. You can decide differently. You can choose differently. And those repeated choices slowly start changing your position. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently changing your position. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. Because progress is never built in a single moment, it is built through patterns. And the moment your pattern changes, your results begin changing with it. You stop reacting to money, you begin directing it, you stop asking where it disappeared to, and begin knowing exactly where it's headed. And over time, that clarity builds something powerful, control. Not the type of control that depends on earning huge amounts, but the kind that comes from using what you already have with intention. That is when the cycle starts breaking apart because the paycheck no longer becomes the reset point. It becomes the starting point, a place where decisions have already been made, direction already exists, and your money begins moving in alignment with where you want your life to go. What you are about to hear is not simply about budgeting. It is about changing the way you think. Because once that shift takes place, everything else starts following it. And if you stay with this long enough, you may realize something important, that you were never trapped because of your income. You were trapped because your money lacked direction, and that can change. Because of your income, you were trapped because your money lacked direction, and that can change. There is a pattern many men fall into, not from irresponsibility, but from repetition so familiar that it goes unquestioned. It is the pattern of receiving and releasing, earning money, holding it briefly, and then watching it scatter into many different directions until almost nothing remains. At first, this pattern does not seem dangerous because life continues moving forward. Yet over time, it creates a condition that keeps a man locked in repetition without advancement. A man works hard, gives his effort, and receives his pay. For a brief moment, there is relief, a feeling that progress has been made. But that moment disappears quickly. Responsibilities appear, needs demand attention, and decisions are made rapidly, often without deep thought. The money moves not toward one clear destination, but toward many different places. And before long, what arrived has already been scattered. This process repeats itself again and again. This process repeats itself again and again and again. Every cycle feels separate, yet each one mirrors the last. The man does not see himself as reckless. He believes he is handling his situation responsibly. He considers his choices, weighs options carefully, and acts with what feels like caution. Yet despite this awareness, the result never changes. The issue is not effort, but structure. Most men do not direct money. They respond to it. They allow the arrival of money to trigger reactions. Bills get paid because they demand attention. Purchases happen because they seem necessary. Small expenses appear because they feel insignificant. Every action seems justified in the moment, yet together they create a pattern. They create a pattern rarely examined as a whole. There is an important distinction that must be understood. Movement is not the same as progress. Money can move constantly while producing no growth at all. It can pass through a man's hands without leaving anything behind. This creates the illusion of activity while preventing accumulation. Many men mistake this movement for control. They believe that because they monitor their spending, they are directing it. Yet awareness without intention decided in advance is incomplete. It notices, but it does not guide. It reacts, but it does not shape. And without direction, money follows the easiest path. It goes wherever it is pulled instead of where it is intentionally sent. There are endless examples of people who increased their income, worked hard, stayed disciplined, yet remained stuck in the same financial position. Their effort was real. Their consistency was undeniable. Yet their outcomes failed to reflect their work. Why? Because what they earned was never assigned a clear role. It arrived and was spent, but never directed. This is the condition of receiving without retaining. A man becomes skilled inside the cycle. He learns how to manage obligations, distribute income, and continue functioning without interruption. Yet he never escapes the cycle because nothing inside it creates growth. Other people often describe such a man as responsible. They see his reliability, his effort, his consistency. But they notice something else too. His position never changes. He works but does not advance. He earns but he does not build. And this perception, even if subtle, matters because people who remain active without progressing are seen as stable. And this perception, even if subtle, matters because people who remain active without progressing are seen as stable, but not evolving. There is a statement that can interrupt this cycle. I do not simply receive money, I give it a purpose before it moves. This idea completely changes the role of money. It transforms money from something handled into something directed. As this understanding grows, the individual begins viewing his situation differently. He stops focusing only on what he earns and starts paying attention to what happens afterward. He studies the path his money takes, not as isolated actions, but as a connected system. He begins asking questions. Where is this going? Why is it going there? What remains once it is gone? These questions create clarity where assumptions once existed. The man begins seeing that his pattern is not random, it is consistent. And because it is consistent, it can be changed. not through harder effort, but through different direction. At first, this realization may feel uncomfortable. The individual may suddenly recognize how much money has been moving without purpose, how many choices were reactions instead of intentional decisions. But this discomfort is not failure. It is the beginning of control, because once a pattern becomes visible, it can be changed. The person begins assigning roles to money before it even arrives. Not afterward when pressure appears, but beforehand when the mind is clear. He decides in advance what portion serves which purpose, and this small shift changes everything. Money no longer arrives without direction. It arrives with instructions, and instructions reduce confusion. Others start noticing the difference. They see someone who no longer wonders where his money disappeared to. He already knows. He already decided. His behavior is no longer reactive. It is intentional. There is a sense of order in the way he operates that did not exist before. This changes how people see him. He is no longer viewed as someone who merely manages money, but as who directs it. And those are not the same thing. Because management maintains, but direction builds. There's also a shift in how the individual experiences his own finances. The uncertainty begins fading. The question of where did it go changes into this is where it's going. That subtle shift creates a feeling of control that once felt absent. It must be understood that this transformation does not require huge amounts of money. It requires clarity. The individual does not need more in order to begin directing. He only needs to direct what he already has. There may be resistance to this process. The mind is used to reacting, to allowing urgency to decide action. It may argue that planning ahead is unnecessary, that flexibility is better. But what must be understood is that flexibility without structure creates repetition. Structure creates freedom. Because once direction exists, the individual is no longer pulled in every direction at once. He moves intentionally, and his money follows that movement. Over time, the individual is no longer pulled in every direction at once. He moves intentionally, and his money follows that movement. Over time, this begins creating a different result. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. A small amount begins remaining. Then, more remains. And what once vanished completely slowly starts accumulating. This is how change begins. Not through greater effort, but through directed flow. Thus, the first and most important realization is this. The problem is not that money comes and goes. The problem is that it goes without purpose. The man who understands this no longer tries to hold money through force. He gives it direction, and through that direction, he begins moving from repetition into progress.